facto national attorney advocate for the recognition and treatment of PANDAS/PANS, a voluntary role she assumed after her son suffered severe mental illness as a result of an undiagnosed strep infection. Harnessing her skills and contacts gained from working in the entertainment industry, she pushed recognition of his disorder forward, starting with the publication of her memoir, Saving Sammy. Sold to Random House in a bidding war, it propelled the disorder to national attention when she appeared on the Today Show with her fully recovered son, Sammy. Seeking to further empower parents, she wrote Childhood Interrupted. It is the one and only resource guide about the disorder. In 2015, she was named by the Wall Street Journal in 5 Things to Know About PANS. She also championed the 2016 documentary, My Kid Is Not Crazy. For people that don't know, what is PANDAS or PANS?
It is infection-triggered mental illness symptoms. Okay. So PANDAS has a long name: Pediatric, Autoimmune, Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Strep. Mm-hmm. PANDAS was originally recognized in the late 90s as mental health symptoms being triggered by strep. And there's a lot of research that supports that. Mm-hmm. Because of that, then researchers started thinking maybe other infections could also trigger it. Mm-hmm. So that's where PANS came from, which is pediatric, acute onset, do they call it neuropsychiatric syndrome? I think they have to double check. But that is the same principle. It's just different infections. So Lyme or mycoplasma is suspected of also causing mental health symptoms.
Okay. So it's a strep infection that causes mental health problems, as you just said. It's not related to the typical strep throat that many people can have in life.
It's the same bacteria.
Okay.
But in some patients, the research is largely pediatric. That's why it's called, it's only pediatric. That's why the research is called pediatric, or the disorder is called pediatric. Doesn't mean that it can't affect particularly young adults, but chances are if you're going to have this reaction, you will have had it as a pediatric patient, because most people do contract strep as children. Mm-hmm. Not everybody develops the psych symptoms.
Right. Of course. Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? Same thing. And some people, for example, like Sammy, never get a sore throat, so you don't even realize they have the infection.
Right.
Which is troublesome.
Right, of course. So can you tell us a little bit about Sammy's OCD, his PANDAS, /PANDAS, what he went through? It was a long journey, his obsessions, compulsions. Also, I know he had some tics. Mm-hmm. So just kind of, can you give us like a general overview? I know that it's very intense in and of itself.
Yes, it was very intense. The first thing I noticed was that he would really not open his eyes. He was walking around with his eyes. He would hold them like this all the time and look at you like that. That was the very first thing that happened. And then from there, it just snowballed. So he would constantly have to be spinning. He couldn't stand the ticking of clocks, so he wanted all the clocks off the wall. We had to have the lights on in the house 24/7. Every single window had to be closed all the time, and it was the heat of summer. He couldn't eat if we breathed too loudly. He had to sit in a particular chair. He would not sleep in his bed. He wanted to sleep sitting up. I'm still not sure whether he actually slept when he was sitting up, but he would always be sitting up. There were certain things he couldn't touch. So it was pretty endless. And every day, I would say there would be something new. Sometimes he had to crawl, sometimes he had to hop. And that would be in addition to everything else he already was doing. He couldn't flush a toilet. He couldn't turn a door handle. He couldn't turn a faucet. So he was completely incapacitated, as you can imagine. There was really nothing that he could do.
Right. And yeah. And it's, yeah, it's very debilitating. And I know because I have OCD, so I totally
Right.
understand. But mine go with thoughts, and I'm actually dealing with some of it right now. And it's caused by stress, and it goes to existentialistic thoughts. I don't like to see, I don't like to think, and it manifests itself, and it's very, anyways, like for Sammy, it's very debilitating.
Right. Debilitating.
Yeah.
It's like dealing with a bully, right?
Exactly. And it's totally your mind just, going kind of quote unquote crazy, So
he said that even though many of the behaviors he realized there was no logic to it, it was just something he couldn't stop doing.
Right. Of
Just
course.
control it.
Yeah. So when did Sammy get diagnosed with his OCD, and how did you feel as a result when he got his diagnosis?
It was probably 3 months into the onset. So let's say from the first time I saw him walking around with his eyes closed basically into slits, it took about 3 months in order to get him in to see a child psychiatrist. We live in Maine, and it was very difficult. We have a real, very few in the state. I know it's a problem everywhere, but in Maine, it's much worse. So I eventually got him to see someone in New Hampshire, and I explained in the book how that happened. And that psychiatrist diagnosed him with obsessive compulsive disorder. And it never felt right to me. Because I couldn't find any history of it in the family. I couldn't find really any logical explanation that this would just suddenly happen to him after 12 years of quote unquote normalcy. So I can't say I felt relieved, even though perhaps someone else might have felt relieved. Oh, we have a diagnosis. I just felt confused.
Right. And that must have been really frustrating. That must have been really frustrating to deal with.
Yeah, it was frustrating. And then when I was leaving the office, the psychiatrist said sometimes the children get well and sometimes they don't. And I looked right at him and I said, my son will get well. I was that determined from the moment. He had run away, for example, just behaviors that were completely out of character, never even a hint of any of it. So I accepted it because this was the psychiatrist telling me that. I mean, on one level I accepted it, but on the other level, I just was never really confident.
Right. Oh, and, that makes sense. And like for any, mother or parent, I mean, like you, like my mom and so forth, you want to get the best treatment for your child who's suffering, or your children. And, you go to nth degree to, to get the right diagnosis and to get the right treatment.
Exactly.
So first of all, you wrote this memoir, Saving Sammy, Mother's Fight to Cure Her Son's OCD. So in this book, you discuss how the move to a new home could have maybe triggered Sammy's OCD, And you often mention and go back to this move as a result of his OCD. And, you know, I can tell that there was some anger or shame involved. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, the first behavior, which was the closed eyes, coincided with the fact that we were packing to move. So a lot of things had happened within a short period of time. My divorce came through. I bought a house. He was leaving grade school. His big brother going into middle school. His big brother was going away to a boarding high school. And because the doctors could not give me an answer as to why this would suddenly come on, I started trying to find the answers myself. So I would not say I was ashamed in that I was doing a lot of self-blaming, but I was trying to figure out what could possibly have caused this. So I might have even done some research at that point and read that stress could increase OCD. So I thought, oh, that must be it, you know, that somehow this all triggered this behavioral explosion. And perhaps if I hadn't gotten, I mean, I went through the litany of everything. Maybe if I fed him differently, maybe if we hadn't moved, maybe if I didn't get divorced, why did I take him away from the ocean? We were so close there. He liked that. He was grieving. I had every possibility other than the fact that he had an infection. That was one thing that never occurred to anyone. And by the way, there's a very long history of mothers being blamed for psychiatric conditions in their children. That's pretty long history there of that. So I guess on some level, without even realizing it, I was tapping into that. Although no one ever accused me of that. So I want to be clear about that.
Right. And so what advice would you give to other parents who are struggling to accept their child's diagnosis?
Well, honestly, the first thing I would say is that I would never accept a mental health diagnosis without thoroughly ruling out the possibility of an underlying physical cause. That is the first thing. I would want to be 100% confident that that had been thoroughly ruled out. And that is a big effort, because a lot of times you meet a lot of resistance from physicians in terms of taking a look at that. Once you would be confident that that would be an accurate diagnosis, then the best thing, I guess, is to get as many supports in place to help your child cope with it. And I think that the older the child becomes, the more they're able to cooperate, or I don't want to say cooperate, but become more of the process and understand what's involved and really understand their own condition.
Right. No, for sure. That's great advice. Now, what would you suggest or, advise parents who are struggling because they feel at fault for their child's diagnosis?
I would say it's probably not your fault. It's probably, most likely, not your fault. Unless you were an alcoholic while you were pregnant or doing some heavy-duty drugs. There probably isn't much that you could be responsible for. You can't really, I mean, obviously, if you're an abusive parent, then you could inflict mental health disorders on your child. I certainly know that from the amount of child protection work I've done. You can inflict trauma and stress, but an ordinary parent who is doing their best every day to do what they can is not going to be responsible for their child's illness. Some people are just born differently.
Yeah.
That simple.
Yeah. And it's hard because not every parent will allow themselves to, not feel at fault. They feel like they, that it was their, fault, like the question I just asked. And, I think compassion and, understanding, can go a long way.
Of yourself, right? It took, as I write in the book, since I could not come up with a reason as to why he suddenly developed this obsessive compulsive disorder, and no one could give me a reason, I just blamed myself for a year until he was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. And then I just thought, okay, there's no way I'm responsible for that. That maybe I can construct all these reasons I put in there. I always like to have the kitchen clean before I went to sleep, have it tidy. Like maybe this is an exaggerated version of that. I would go through all these possibilities in my head, but Tourette syndrome, no. So that kind of eliminated the self-blame entirely. It was very freeing, that diagnosis for me, because I thought, okay, clearly you didn't cause this.
So how was Sammy's schooling affected by his condition?
So he did not go to the physics for the first couple of months, maybe even 6 months. I kept trying to get him to school. He could not physically get there. He couldn't go in the building. He could, in order to get out of the car, he had to open the door and shut the door and open the door and shut the door. He had to hop patterns on bricks in order to get into the building. Once in the building, he had all kinds of rituals and routines he had to do. It became impossible. So, and he really tried hard to go, but he couldn't. And so he became really too sick to do anything at all, even any kind of, we tried to do some form of a homeschooling program. I think what happens is that the further you get away from, let's just use the word normal, the further you get away from that, the harder it is to hang on to that. So in the beginning, it was a month out from quote unquote normal, then 2 months, then 3 months, then 6 months. And so it was very hard to hang on to that possibility of that routine. So we had to just let it go. And it wasn't until when he had been sick for a full year and we finally went to see, well, we first learned about the possibility of PANDAS, and really just by divine intervention, as far as I can put together, and then went and saw a different doctor and got the diagnosis, and he was treated, and then he started to get better. It was really another 6 months before he was able to participate in any kind of schooling. There was a brief period of time, I'd have to remember exactly when it was, that we tried to have him in school. They had a special education program. I thought that was terrific. Great. They're going to give him the supports that he needs. That was a disaster. And then eventually the school was I had a very lovely school system, and they sent a tutor to the home. And Sammy was able to do he missed all of 6th and 7th grade, but he was able to make up all that work in about 6 months. So when he went back to 8th grade, he was on par academically, although it was socially behind, because of course they had all had 2 years of being friends, and it was tough.
So how did he make up for lost time? He's in 6th and 7th grade. Was it at home? Was it at school?
It was at home.
Okay.
It was at home with a tutor coming to the house. Okay. And he actually, so let's say he started, I'm guessing so he missed all of 6th grade. About halfway through his 7th grade year, he starts improving. The tutor started coming to the house. She came maybe twice a week. And so between that February and then 2 weeks prior to the start of 8th grade, he completed the 6th and 7th grade curriculum, working one-on-one with this tutor 2 days a week. He's also a really bright, he was a bright kid. He's still an incredibly bright adult. So he had a little bit of an edge there, because something that might have taken somebody else longer to learn, he was able to learn it very quickly because his mind works that way. Right. So it does make me wonder, though, about this incredible, frankly, focus about kids missing school this year, because I look at it and think, okay, well, it worked out.
Right.
I know it's difficult, but, you know, it worked out.
Of course.
So,
and things always work out, you know, there's never a, you know, end to something. I mean, there's always an end to something, you know, even though I'm dealing with my own issues right now, like I know that it will end. I've dealt with this before, and you know, it's just really hard to, you know, it's just a way of managing, you know,
through the rough time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So Sammy was, when he went back to school, he was placed in a special education classroom. How did that make you feel?
I was fine with that, but understand that the special ed classroom took place, I think it was during 6th grade, when we were still trying to see if we could integrate him. And I thought it was going to be terrific, but it wasn't. When he went back to 8th grade, he just went right back into a regular classroom because he was up to par. The difficulty with the special education classroom, which I was very much in favor of, I think special education is terrific. If your child needs it, get as much of it as you can. The problem was that the teachers did not really understand that when OCD is not a discipline issue. A student isn't a student. There are certain things that student is not able to do. Everybody is supposed to stand up and leave the classroom at a certain time, and you have a child who has a checking compulsion, and before they can leave the classroom, they have to check their backpack and then recheck their or whatever it is. They're not doing that to be difficult or because it's a discipline issue. It's just something they have to do. And that's a hard concept even for me to understand in the beginning, which I did come to understand, which I couldn't have made Sammy touch a faucet. He could not touch the faucet. Eventually he had cognitive behavioral therapy to help with the things he was unable to do, but there's a difference between being unwilling to do something and being unable. And the visual I used to use was, if somebody was in a wheelchair, you wouldn't stand there shouting at them to get up and walk. They can't do it. They're not in that wheelchair because they want to be. So I think a lot of children, that's the difficulty that I think sometimes parents run into, that their children are treated as discipline issues rather than an inability to do things.
Right. No, I would agree with that. So actually just talking a little bit about therapy, you had mentioned that he was in CBT therapy, which I know very well. I have a CBT therapist. What else, if anything, for therapy was Sammy doing to overcome his issues?
Well, for a period of time, he was in talk therapy, which was useless. It was useless. There was, which I didn't know at the time, but there's a part in the book where we're doing these faces, and he's supposed to outline, you know, the happy face to the sad face. And I'm saying, okay, how about this? Is this stressful? How about that? Is that stressful? And I remember, and he was, you know, 12 at the time. And I remember distinctly when he looked at me and he said, "Mom, I just never knew there were so many things to be stressful about." Because it wasn't stress. It was just the way it was. Talking about it wasn't going to make it better for him. Now, that might not be true of every child, but talking about walking out the door that he cannot walk out, there was no relief from that. If anything, it made him more frustrated because he couldn't explain why he couldn't walk out the door. He just couldn't do it.
Right.
Then when he got into CBT and he was given specific exercises to do to help, he couldn't step on a mat. He could not step on a mat. So why couldn't he step on the mat? I don't know. He didn't know. He just couldn't step on the mat. So eventually, when he had the appropriate therapy, which might have been to first walk in a circle around the mat or whatever it was, and then get an inch closer to the mat, and then, those kinds of things helped. Talking about why he couldn't walk on the mat was useless.
Right.
For him.
For sure. And so now getting back to Josh and James, which are Sammy's brothers, how did they both handle Sammy's condition, both his Tourette syndrome, his PANDAS / OCD?
Well, Josh was 15 at the time, and fortunately for him, he was at a boarding high school.
Right.
So he rarely, he didn't really have a lot of time in the home when Sammy was going through this. He was frustrated by it. I think most 15-year-olds I've met probably would be frustrated by it. There's not necessarily a whole lot of empathy going on there. It's like, why can't he get in the car so we can leave, or whatever it was. So it was fortunate for him because he was away. Right. James, really, he was just terribly sad because he was, of course, living here the whole time, and it was just sad. The whole house was sad. I mean, it was sad to be here because Sammy himself was sad because he was so sick. So James, I had James spend a lot of time out of the house, at friends' houses, going to after-school programs. Thank goodness he has a lot of energy, being in soccer, whatever I could do to keep him kind of out and away, but he couldn't have any friends over to play. So it was a sad time for him. And then he started getting worried. Now, he was 8 years old at the time. So he started getting very worried that maybe he had it. So he would come running out of the bathroom. I might be fixing something in the kitchen. I remember he ran out this one time and he said, "I think I've got it." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I washed my hands and then I wasn't really sure whether I washed them well enough, so I did it again." So I said, I think it's okay. So he did become very concerned about that.
Right. And that's to be expected when he has a brother that has or had, severe OCD.
Right. One other thing I want to mention is that I had put in there that he also wondered why this had to happen to him. Why did he have to be the person in the world who had a brother? And he called it Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, which I think is also very insightful in terms of an 8-year-old. It's not so much the empathy for Sammy, which he did have that, but he just felt so unlucky that he was the one who had a brother who had this.
Right.
It's heartbreaking, the whole thing.
Yeah, of course. It must, what I can just tell from reading your book that it was heartbreaking for your whole family. And fortunately, you guys are out of the woods now. But you went through a devastating, tumultuous, or, difficult time, or very difficult time, I should say.
Which I want to say, I think that actually worked in our favor because if he had not been that sick, if he had not been completely unable to function, if he hadn't been able to go to school, if the whole house had just not been so sad and depressed, if he had had a functional version, it might have been something that we just accepted in the same way that you might accept, I don't know, I can't think of a good analogy, but he was so ill, so completely incapacitated that it empowered me to keep looking.
Of course. And that's a great thing.
Yeah.
Did you ever think that your divorce was a precursor to Sammy's condition?
I thought that at the same time that I thought it was the house, the move, the brother going away, finishing grade school, maybe it's because of the divorce. But the truth of the matter is, in retrospect, you don't really get divorced quickly. It takes a while. So I wasn't thinking of it like that. You know, the fact that the order came down and we moved, I don't think, if I'd been thinking logically, well, I mean, there is some logic to that. So I did think that, but I was incorrect about that, as I was so many other self-blaming things.
Right, of course. And so just talking about, you know, Sammy's father, your ex-husband, and so forth, if you feel comfortable, from what I gather, he wasn't very involved in Sammy's life with his condition, especially. What do you think the reasoning behind that was?
I don't know, but I will say this, that there are many times people will say, oh, that was so difficult that you went through that on your own. However, the truth is, so now I'm in touch with thousands of parents all the time. I get emails every day. I help people with cases. It's all kinds of stuff. And I've actually found a number of situations where moms are restrained because of the dad. I never had that. So if I found out there was this doctor in New Jersey who was capable of treating that, we got in the car and we went. There are, unfortunately, situations where I've had moms email and say, he tells me that if I mention PANDAS again, he'll cut off the money. I'm thinking, okay, well, that's a tough one. So to the extent that parents might be out there basically alone, as long as the other parent isn't interfering with what it is they're trying to accomplish, I wouldn't spend a lot of time wishing they were on board. They're not on board, and frankly, could be very difficult if they wanted to create problems. Another thing that sometimes will happen is that if you have one parent, and you know, frankly, it's primarily mom who's taking care of the kids, and dad, for whatever reason, starts threatening the medical providers with lawsuits. Okay, well, that doesn't really help.
Exactly.
So I'm sure there'll be some parents who've had this, who are watching this, who have had that experience. And it's really tough. I don't know what to tell parents when they come to me with that problem, because a doctor makes their own decisions about who they are going to treat. And if they feel that their medical license is going to be put in jeopardy, their decision they're not really interested in getting themselves in the middle of a battle. So it's unfortunate that some parents try to do that. It hurts the kids.
Oh, for sure. It's hard, especially, you know, when, you know, you only have one parent that's really kind of, you know, supports you, you know, 100%.
Right. I don't know, you know, I don't know whether it just, I guess it's just the difference between being a mom and a dad. You know, moms are just different and dads are different too. And so for some reason, dads seem to have a tougher time,
Mhm.
and I don't know why. So I can't really, you'd have to ask someone who.
Yeah, I have no idea either.
Yeah, there must be an answer there.
Yeah, no, for sure. And there are situations where parents definitely like come together. I know somebody who unfortunately they lost their child, but had pediatric cancer. And you know, it was a journey, and you know, they celebrated her life. They have two other children now. And they have their own organization. But it's, you know, it's something that, you know, could have pulled, you know, the parents, you know, apart. And surprisingly, actually, it was the complete opposite. It even pulled them closer. They're still together. And, you know, it's an amazing.
It just depends, you know, it just depends. And it depends. I think it also depends on the illness. I think that sometimes physical illness is like a cancer, not all the time, but sometimes that's a little easier to accept because it is, you know, there is a test. It is, whereas a mental health diagnosis is different, and it's harder to accept. And so you either say, okay, well, I'm going to do everything I can about this, or you, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not the right person to ask you there. I'm sure somebody's written a whole book about this.
Yeah, no, of course.
Get back to like lions in Africa and the.
No, we don't have to get into it. I was just.
I don't know.
I'm just talking.
Right. All I can say is for me, it worked out okay. And so those parents who might be watching, who are essentially single parents, even though you wish it could be different, it actually could be a lot worse because there are unfortunately partners who actively interfere and prevent treatment. And that is just unacceptable.
Right. No,
You know?
totally agree. So how did you stay calm and collected, quote unquote, during these, you know, unbelievable hard years of, you know, you and your family's lives?
I would say I was never calm or collected.
Okay.
However, Sammy never knew that.
Okay.
So I was always frantic.
Right.
Frantic to find the answer, frantic to help him, frantic to alleviate the incredible pain that I knew he was in. I was determined and I had a lot of energy and I was focused, but I never was calm or collected. And I will say that when Sammy read the book, he decided he better read it when we were going to go on the Today Show. So he read the book and he said, boy, you really had me fooled. Because as far as he knew, I would just say to him, we're going to get you better. And he never knew that I ever even wondered whether that would happen. So I really felt very successful when he said that to me. I did a good job of hiding my doubts, and there was no reason to know any of that.
A lot of parents do that. I mean, I'm sure with my own set of issues, you know, my mom definitely, you know, has a hard time with it. But, you know, she hides it, and
Right.
you know, it's, you know, I think that's what a lot of parents do, you know, for their children.
Right. You hide it from the kids. You can tell your friends all about it, you know.
Oh, of course.
Right?
And I know you did, but
no.
yeah. Aside from Sammy reading the book, does he have any like recollection of what he dealt with and his like distressing obsessions and compulsions to this day? Aside from reading the book.
Yeah, he does. I mean, he can distinctly remember periods of time when he would. I remember one time he was home. Now, this was a few years ago, but I remember he was walking by a wall and he stopped and he kind of went like that. He said, "That's the spot?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "In my head, it was giant because every time he went by this I think it was the size of maybe a nail hole. He had to go through all kinds of compulsions and actions and all this, kind of stuff that he had to do. And he was surprised to see it, that it was such a tiny thing that had dominated his life at that point. So he does remember. I mean, he will occasionally, if I brought something up to him, he would say, "Oh, I remember that," because he does remember it, but it's not something he dwells on or talks about. And frankly, it was such a horrible period. I mean, why would he? He did a lot in about the first year after the book came out. He did a lot of shows with me and so forth. And then it was kind of like, okay.
Yeah, no, that's why I had suggested originally, like, you and Sammy. I mean, obviously you guys are in different places, but I would have just never thought, because I learned about you and Sammy through the Today Show and just Googling, OCD and so forth. So, it's probably a way for him to kind of like separate himself from this, I mean, and I don't want to put words in his mouth or, your mouth, but, from this awful, state that he went through. That,
well, I think he just didn't want that to be his identity.
Right.
And so he also, I think he's a humble guy, and he has a hard time understanding how many lives he actually has changed by letting me write his story and publish the book, which would be hard, right? If you were very young when all this happened. He was about 19, I think, when the book came out, and it was boom, everything changed. And so it's kind of hard at that age to recognize it. And then I think he just has gone from there,
Of course. So did Sammy ever think when he was going through that he was different than his peers, or did he just think he was just an ordinary kid?
When he had all these behaviors, he knew he was different.
Okay, he did know he was different.
Because he knew he was different from who he had been, because he was suddenly having to do things that he had never done, and he was aware that he was creating a lot of, not chaos in the house, but I don't want to use, I guess it would be chaos, but that's not exactly the right word. Just creating difficulty. Things suddenly had to be very different than they were before. And so he actually felt very guilty about that, because he knew that it was creating a lot of trouble, and yet he didn't know how to stop. He couldn't stop himself. He felt guilty,
Right. No, of course. And so, in all of this, did, how do you think, let's just go back actually. Why do you think Sammy liked school so much when he did go back to school?
He just is a lifelong learner.
Okay.
I mean, that's what he is. He is a lifelong learner.
Right.
And he just couldn't wait to get back. And then even when he finished high school, and then he even started college early. He went for the summer semester because he was so excited, because he couldn't wait to get going. And that's just his personality. He still is a lifelong learner. He constantly listens to books on Audible at like 3 times the regular speed or something like that. I don't even know how he understands it, because he's just constantly, assimilating information.
Right.
So, and of course it was a mark of success, right? He went back.
Of course.
He went back.
Yeah. Now, so what are your thoughts on medicine, treatment, and mental health disorders in the field today?
Well, I, of course, can't really go beyond these particular disorders. So I I don't know anything in particular about bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or anything like that. I just know that
And I'm just
anytime.
talking about the realm of OCD, Tourette syndrome, and
Okay.
that he
Well, I mean, I just have to keep going back to what I said originally, which is that I just wouldn't accept a mental health diagnosis without ruling out an infectious cause. And if in fact there is an infection underlying it, what happens is doctors are too easily, in my opinion, just tag the child with mental health. Oh, it must be this, it must be that, without ever stopping to think, well, could there be a reason for that?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to find a doctor who thinks that way. I'll give you a specific example where I'm looking at a situation of a young adult who is in a state hospital. And when I looked, and has probably 15 different mental health diagnoses. And when I look at those medical records, I see that this kiddo had infection after infection after infection. By the time he was 11 years old, he had had so many infections, I can't even count them all.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't discount the fact that somehow that's related to where he is today.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody needs to be willing to get in there and tease that out and see whether there is still something underlying it.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody responds to 10 days of penicillin.
Right.
Some people take a little longer.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody who has Lyme gets a bullseye.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have mental health symptoms or they have physical symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And the reluctance of physicians to cross between those two areas, between physical health and mental health, I don't think really does a lot of, I think it's a disservice to patients to not look at it.
Right. No, of course.
Now, that doesn't mean, though, that individuals who maybe have an infectious basis, they are going to need some kind of a psychiatric medication because the effect can be really debilitating. And that's what helps them over the hump.
Right.
So those are my thoughts, but they're also very much based on our own experience, right? And the experience of a lot of people who I've spoken with where unfortunately doctors just missed it.
Of course. And so lastly, which is probably what most people want to know after watching this interview, is how is Sammy today? He's thriving. What is he doing? Is he on any type of medication? And so forth.
He's not on medication. He is thriving. He's a computer scientist. He graduated from Carnegie Mellon with a degree in computer science and mathematics. And so he moved to Seattle to be in the tech industry. And he worked for Google for a couple of years. And then he moved to a smaller company where he's now been for a couple of years. And he's doing incredibly well, other than the fact that everybody in Seattle is on lockdown and quarantine, which is pretty much a bummer. But prior to that, it was great. And I mean, it's fine. It's just that
right.
He's stuck in an apartment in Seattle.
The virus and the pandemic, I mean, it's caused
Right.
a lot of distress for a lot of people. And
Right.